Brandt specifically notes that the movements, while clearly not voluntary, had a terrible rhythm to them, as if the dancers heard music none of us could perceive. Third, and perhaps most damning, ergot poisoning would have affected far more than 400 people. If Strasbourg's grain supply was contaminated, the entire city would have been eating the same bread. Ergotism doesn't spread person to person like a contagion. It strikes everyone who consumes the contaminated grain at roughly the same time. We should see evidence of widespread ergotism affecting thousands of people simultaneously. Instead, we have a relatively contained outbreak, affecting a specific subset of the population, starting with one person and spreading gradually over weeks. The pattern of spread is completely wrong for ergot poisoning. The dancing began with Frau Troffea on a single day in mid-July, then spread to others gradually over the following weeks. Ergot poisoning would have hit multiple people at once as they consumed contaminated bread, not spread person to person in a contagion-like pattern. So ergot is out. What about other substances? Some researchers have proposed that the dancers consumed psychoactive plants, belladonna, henbane, mandrake, or other substances that medieval Europe had access to. Maybe some kind of ritual or accidental contamination led to mass intoxication. But again, the symptom profile doesn't match. Psychoactive plant poisoning causes disorientation, hallucinations, either sedation or agitation, but not sustained rhythmic dancing. Moreover, the duration is completely wrong. Plant-based psychoactive compounds clear from the body within hours to perhaps a couple of days at most. The Strasbourg dancers continued for days or weeks without any new substance intake. Frau Troffea danced for 6 days straight. Drug-induced behavior doesn't persist for 6 days after a single exposure. What about environmental factors? Perhaps contaminated water, or unusually poor air quality, or some other local condition triggered the outbreak. This theory has the advantage of being less specific and therefore harder to fully disprove, but it still fails to explain the person-to-person spread pattern, or why only a specific subset of the population was affected while others living in the same conditions remained completely fine. This brings us to the explanation that most modern medical historians and psychologists consider most likely: mass psychogenic illness. And I need to address something immediately before we go further. When we use terms like psychogenic or mass hysteria, there's an unfortunate tendency to dismiss the phenomenon as fake, as all in their heads, or to imply the sufferers were weak or making it up for attention. That is absolutely, categorically wrong. Mass psychogenic illness is a real medical phenomenon with genuine physical symptoms. The dancers' feet really bled. Their hearts really gave out. People really died. The suffering was absolutely authentic and terrible. What makes it psychogenic is the origin mechanism. It begins in the mind rather than from external toxins or pathogens, but that doesn't make it less real. Your mind is powerful enough to generate genuine physical symptoms, sometimes dramatic and life-threatening ones. Let me give you a modern example so you understand how real this is. In 1962, at a textile factory in North Carolina, 62 workers became seriously ill over a period of several days. They experienced nausea, dizziness, numbness, and difficulty breathing. The factory was evacuated. Hazmat teams arrived wearing full protective equipment. They tested for toxic chemicals, gas leaks, contaminated water, everything. They found absolutely nothing. Medical examinations revealed no toxins in the workers' blood or urine. After weeks of investigation, epidemiologists concluded it was mass psychogenic illness. The symptoms were real, People genuinely felt sick and some were hospitalized, but the cause was psychological stress manifesting as physical symptoms, triggered by one worker's genuine illness from an insect bite and spreading through the workforce as others unconsciously mimicked those symptoms under the stress of difficult working conditions. Or consider 2011 in upstate New York, where dozens of teenage girls suddenly developed Tourette's-like symptoms, uncontrollable tics, verbal outbursts, movements they couldn't control. Extensive neurological testing found no organic cause. Environmental investigations found no toxins. Eventually, researchers concluded it was mass psychogenic illness spreading through a tight-knit school community, amplified by social media that allowed symptoms to spread beyond just face-to-face contact. These aren't medieval peasants, these are modern people with access to advanced medicine living in developed nations. Mass psychogenic illness still happens. The symptoms just change based on what seems plausible within that cultural context. And here's where this story gets even more disturbing, because to understand why dancing specifically became the symptom in Strasbourg, we need to understand the conditions these people were living under. And what you're about to hear will make you realize that the dancing wasn't the strangest thing happening in 1518. The strange thing was that the entire city didn't completely break down. If you're fascinated by how psychology and history intersect to create events that seem impossible but actually happened, hit that like button right now. Subscribe because we explore historical events that challenge everything you think you understand about human behavior. And keep watching because the second half of this video is going to reframe everything you just heard in a way that makes it perfect sense, which is somehow more unsettling than if it remained a complete mystery. To understand the dancing plague of 1518, you need to understand that Strasbourg wasn't a city having a bad year. It was a community in the grip of a sustained multi-year catastrophe that had pushed the entire population to the edge of psychological collapse. Let me paint a picture of what life was actually like in early 15th century Strasbourg, because until you understand the pressure these people were under, the dancing makes no sense. The winter of 1516-1517 had been one of the coldest in living memory. Crops froze in the fields, livestock died. The spring planting of 1517 failed when floods drowned what little had managed to survive the winter. The summer brought a drought that withered the rest. By fall 1517, food prices had quadrupled. By winter 1517-1518, people were starving. I don't mean hungry, I mean starving, the kind of malnutrition that causes your body to consume its own muscle tissue to survive. Contemporary accounts describe beggars dying in the streets, their bodies too weak to even beg anymore. Children with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs. Families reduced to eating grass, tree bark, anything that might provide calories. Some accounts, though difficult to verify, suggest cases of cannibalism in the surrounding countryside. When you're severely malnourished, your body doesn't function normally, but more importantly for our story, your brain doesn't function normally. Malnutrition affects judgment, emotional regulation, impulse control. The entire population of Strasbourg was operating on reduced mental capacity, more vulnerable to psychological stress, and less able to maintain normal coping mechanisms. And the malnutrition was just one layer of the crisis. Diseases were epidemic. Syphilis, which had appeared in Europe just 20 years earlier in the 1990s, was ravaging the population. The disease was far more virulent in its early years than it would later become, progressing faster and killing more brutally. Strasbourg, as a major trading city on the Rhine, was particularly hard hit. Medical records describe the horror of watching syphilis progress, the skin lesions, the destruction of soft tissue, the descent into dementia before death. And because the disease was transmitted sexually, it carried intense social shame. Families hid infected members. The sick died in isolation and disgrace. Everyone in Strasbourg either knew someone with syphilis or feared they might contract it themselves. Smallpox outbreaks were regular. Dysentery was constant. The combination of malnutrition and poor sanitation created perfect conditions for disease to spread. Deaths were so common that the city's graveyards were constantly expanding. Everyone in Strasbourg had lost family members, friends, or neighbors to disease. The psychological weight of living under constant threat of sudden, painful death is almost impossible for modern people to comprehend. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating crisis was religious. Remember, this was 1518, just 1 year after Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, launching what would become the Protestant Reformation. The religious certainty that had governed European life for 1,000 years was suddenly in question.
For people whose entire worldview was built on Catholic faith, this crisis of confidence was shattering. If the priests were corrupt, as Luther claimed, were your sins actually forgiven? If the sacraments were invalid, were you doomed to hell despite a lifetime of devotion? If the Pope wasn't God's true representative on earth, had you been worshiping false doctrine your entire life? The existential terror this caused in deeply religious communities is hard for secular modern minds to grasp. Imagine believing with absolute certainty that your immortal soul's fate depends on following the correct religious practices, and then being told that the practices you followed your entire life might be wrong, that priests you trusted might be liars, that the pathway to salvation you'd always believed in might lead to damnation instead. In Strasbourg specifically, this religious crisis was particularly acute. The city was caught between Catholic and emerging Protestant factions. There were street preachers declaring that the Pope was the Antichrist. There were Catholic clerics warning that listening to Protestant heresy would damn your soul to eternal torture. Families were divided, communities fractured. Violence between religious factions was increasingly common. And underlying all of this was the complete failure of authority structures to protect anyone. The Holy Roman Empire was in disarray. Local nobles were more interested in fighting each other than governing. The church was losing credibility. The city council of Strasbourg was overwhelmed and largely ineffective at addressing any of the crises. When every source of authority and stability in your life proves unable to help you, when God seems to have abandoned you, when your leaders are powerless to prevent your suffering, a profound sense of helplessness sets in. And helplessness, when it becomes chronic and inescapable, doesn't just affect your mood, it can manifest in your body in dramatic, sometimes bizarre ways. Now add one more crucial element. Medieval European culture had a long tradition of dancing manias. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The most famous earlier outbreak occurred in 1374 along the Rhine River, where groups of people danced uncontrollably, claiming they were cursed by demons or punished by God for sin. Smaller outbreaks had occurred periodically throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. These earlier dancing manias had created a cultural template. They made uncontrollable dancing a plausible symptom when psychological stress needed a physical outlet. If you were a person in 1518 Strasbourg, suffering from severe malnutrition, traumatized by constant death and disease, terrified for your immortal soul, feeling utterly helpless about the future, your mind needed some way to express that unbearable psychological pressure, and your culture had provided you with a script. Think about Frau Troffea in this context. We don't know her specific circumstances, but we can make educated guesses. She was almost certainly poor or working class, living in one of Strasbourg's less affluent neighborhoods. She had survived the famines, but at what cost? How many family members had she buried? How much trauma had she witnessed? What was the breaking point that sent her into that street? When she began to dance, unable to stop, her body was telling a story her mouth couldn't speak. Her suffering was too enormous to contain in words or even in socially acceptable emotions, so it erupted in physical movement, violent, uncontrollable, terrifying movement that communicated to everyone watching, "I cannot continue. Something has broken inside me. I cannot bear this anymore." And when others saw her, when they witnessed this physical manifestation of the unbearable pressure they all felt, something in their own psyche recognized it. This is what our suffering looks like. This is what breaking under impossible strain looks like. This is our body's rebellion against circumstances that cannot be endured. The contagion wasn't biological, it was psychological. It spread through recognition, through the power of seeing your own internal state reflected in someone else's body. When the stages were built and musicians were hired, the phenomenon became even more visible, even more legitimate, even more impossible to ignore. The unconscious mind of every person already teetering on the edge received a clear message. This is how we express what cannot be expressed. This is how we show that we cannot continue. This is our body's way of saying no more. By mid-August, with 400 people dancing, the dancing plague of 1518 had become a mass nervous breakdown, taking a culturally specific form. These people weren't weak. They weren't more susceptible to suggestion than anyone else. They were normal humans pushed past human limits, and their bodies found the only outlet available. The dancing plague of 1518 was the most severe and well-documented dancing mania in European history, but it wasn't the last. Over the following decades, smaller outbreaks occurred in other stressed communities, always following the same basic pattern, appearing in populations under severe pressure, manifesting as compulsive dancing, spreading through social contact. But gradually, as the 16th and 17th centuries progressed, dancing manias became rarer. By the 18th century, they had effectively vanished. Why? Not because people stopped experiencing severe psychological stress, certainly not because living conditions improved dramatically. In many ways, the early industrial era was more brutal than the late medieval period had been. The change was in the cultural framework. As Protestant thought spread and Enlightenment ideas began to influence European culture, the framework that made uncontrollable dancing a plausible symptom of distress gradually eroded. Dancing became associated with celebration and social activity, not with divine punishment or demonic possession. The cultural script changed, so the physical manifestation of psychological stress changed with it. New forms of mass psychogenic illness emerged instead. Fainting epidemics became common in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly among young women in schools or factories. Seizure-like episodes appeared in religious revival movements. The phenomenon that became known as hysteria in the 19th century produced symptoms like paralysis, blindness, or convulsions that looked nothing like the dancing of 1518, but served the same psychological function. Mass psychogenic illness hasn't disappeared. It's still with us. The symptoms just keep evolving to match contemporary cultural frameworks and anxieties. Remember the cases I mentioned earlier? The textile workers in 1962 with their mysterious illness that no toxin could explain. The teenagers in 2011 with Tourette's-like tics that had no neurological cause. These are our modern dancing plagues. The mechanism is identical, psychological stress converting to physical symptoms that spread through social channels, but the specific presentation changes to match what seems plausible in that cultural context. In recent years, researchers have documented cases where mass psychogenic illness spreads through social media rather than just physical proximity.
In 2019, a school in Colombia experienced an outbreak where students developed tremors and fainting spells after watching videos of other students experiencing similar symptoms. The videos spread through WhatsApp and TikTok, carrying the psychological contagion across digital networks in a way that would have been impossible in 1518, but follows the exact same underlying principles. The cultural context matters enormously for what form the symptoms take. In medieval Strasbourg, where dancing had religious and supernatural associations, stress manifested as compulsive dancing. In modern schools, where neurological disorders like Tourette's are well known, stress sometimes manifests as tic-like behaviors. In factory settings, where chemical exposure is a recognized danger, stress manifests as symptoms that mimic poisoning. This isn't conscious. The people experiencing these symptoms aren't choosing them or faking them. The symptoms are completely genuine and often debilitating. But the unconscious mind draws on available cultural frameworks to determine which physical symptoms will express psychological distress in a way that seems legitimate and will be recognized by others. The dancing plague reveals something profound about the relationship between individual psychology and collective culture. You can't understand Frau Troffea's dancing without understanding the cultural context that made dancing a plausible symptom. You can't understand the spread without understanding the community stress that made others vulnerable to the same psychological breaking point. You can't understand the resolution without understanding the religious framework that provided a ritual for healing. This is why mass psychogenic illness is so difficult to treat using purely medical approaches. It's not fundamentally a medical problem, even though it produces real medical symptoms. It's a social and psychological phenomenon that requires social and psychological solutions. The religious intervention in Severn worked not because Saint Vitus actually intervened, but because the pilgrimage provided several crucial psychological elements. It gave the dancers permission to stop. It created a ritual transition from cursed to healed that allowed them to end the dancing without admitting psychological weakness or failure of faith. It removed them from the environment where the contagion was most concentrated. And perhaps most importantly, it acknowledged communal crisis and created space for collective healing. Modern medicine sometimes struggles with similar problems. We try to treat psychological conditions rooted in social circumstances as purely individual medical issues. Someone is depressed, so we prescribe antidepressants. But what if they're depressed because they're working 2 jobs to barely survive, living in isolation, dealing with discrimination, or trapped in circumstances that would depress anyone? Medication might help with symptoms, and that's valuable, but it doesn't address the root causes any more than making the dancers keep dancing addressed the root causes of their compulsion. Sometimes what people need isn't just individual treatment. They need their circumstances to change. They need community support. They need acknowledgement that what they're experiencing would be difficult for anyone. The dancing plague also reveals something crucial about how trauma accumulates. The people of Strasbourg didn't suddenly develop dancing mania because of one bad event. It was years of compounding hardship, famines, diseases, religious crisis, social instability, constant death and suffering that finally pushed them past the breaking point. Psychological resilience isn't infinite. You can endure a remarkable amount. People are astonishingly strong and adaptable, but resilience gets depleted over time if you're constantly using it without chances to recover. The dancers of Strasbourg had been coping with impossible circumstances for years. They had already exhausted their reserves. When the dancing plague emerged, it was because those reserves were completely gone. This is relevant for understanding mental health crises today. Often there's an assumption that if someone is struggling now, the cause must be something happening right now.
But sometimes people struggle because they've been coping with difficult circumstances for so long that they simply don't have anything left. The final straw that breaks someone might look minor compared to everything else they've endured, but it's not about that final straw. It's about accumulated stress that never got processed and released. The dancing plague of 1518 was Strasbourg's breaking point, the moment when collective trauma found a physical outlet because there was no other option, the moment when suffering that couldn't be spoken had to be danced instead. 5 centuries separate us from Frau Troffea stepping into that street and beginning to dance. 5 centuries of medical advancement, psychological understanding, social change. We have antidepressants and therapy and crisis hotlines and all manner of tools that medieval people couldn't imagine. And yet, mass psychogenic illness still happens. People still break under pressure. Communities still experience collective psychological crises that manifest in physical symptoms no medical test can explain. So what does the dancing plague have to teach us? First, it destroys any comfortable notion that these things happen to other people in other times, but couldn't happen to us. The medieval citizens of Strasbourg weren't fundamentally different from us. They weren't more superstitious or weak-willed or susceptible to mass delusion. They were humans under extreme stress, and they broke in a way that made sense within their cultural context. Put modern people under similar pressure, and we'll break too. The specific symptoms might differ, but the underlying dynamic remains the same. Second, it illustrates that mental health isn't just individual resilience, it's intimately connected to the social, economic, and cultural environment we're embedded in. You can't maintain psychological health indefinitely while living in psychologically unbearable conditions. Eventually, something gives. When we see increases in anxiety, depression, or other psychological problems in our own time, we need to ask not just what's wrong with these individuals, but what conditions are we creating that make psychological health so difficult to maintain? The dancing plague happened because Strasbourg's conditions had become unbearable. What are our unbearable conditions? What are we tolerating as normal that's actually slowly breaking people? Third, the dancing plague shows how we talk about and conceptualize distress matters enormously. The frameworks we create for understanding psychological suffering don't just describe that suffering, they actively shape how it manifests. In 1518, the available framework for expressing unbearable distress included compulsive dancing. Today, our frameworks include anxiety disorders, depression, PTSD, and other diagnostic categories.
These frameworks are useful for treatment, but they also influence how people experience and express their distress. Someone struggling today is more likely to develop symptoms that fit recognized categories because those are the available scripts for making sense of psychological pain. Fourth, the resolution of the dancing plague teaches us about the social functions of symptoms. The dancers weren't consciously trying to communicate anything, but their dancing did communicate. It said without words, "We cannot continue like this. Something must change. We are breaking." And the community had to respond. Families had to care for dancers instead of demanding more labor from them. City authorities had to take action. The shared crisis created space for acknowledgement of suffering that might not have been possible to express directly. Sometimes symptoms, even when completely genuine and involuntary, end up serving functions beyond their immediate expression. They force others to pay attention. They create permission for rest and care. They make invisible suffering visible. Understanding this doesn't mean dismissing symptoms as manipulative. It means recognizing the complex ways that psychological distress operates and communicates. Finally, the dancing plague reminds us of the importance of bearing witness to suffering. The historical records we have exist because people documented what they were seeing even when they didn't understand it.
Physicians examined dancers and recorded symptoms. City scribes noted expenditures and timelines. Writers like Sebastian Brandt documented the horror and the humanity of watching people dance to death. Their documentation means we can learn from this event 500 years later. We can understand it as a case study in how communities break under unbearable pressure. We can recognize the warning signs. We can perhaps avoid creating similar conditions. But beyond the educational value, there's something profoundly human about the act of documentation itself. These medieval writers were saying, this happened. These people suffered. Their experience was real and worthy of being recorded and remembered. When we encounter suffering today, individual or collective, one of the most important things we can do is bear witness to it. Acknowledge that it's happening, refuse to look away or pretend everything is fine. The people of Strasbourg needed their crisis to be seen and validated before they could begin to recover. People in crisis today need the same recognition. In July 1518, Frau Troffea stepped into a street in Strasbourg and began to dance. Within a month, 400 people had joined her, their bodies moving in patterns they couldn't control, their suffering visible to everyone but incomprehensible even to themselves. Dozens died, many more were permanently damaged, and the entire event was documented extensively, preserved in records that make it impossible to dismiss as legend or folklore. What happened in Strasbourg wasn't supernatural, it wasn't poisoning, it wasn't a medical mystery. It was something more fundamental and more human. It was what happens when you push people past their breaking point, when you create conditions so unbearable that the mind must find some outlet, some way to manifest suffering that's too enormous to contain. The dancing plague was a community screaming without words, bodies expressing what mouths couldn't say, a collective breakdown taking a form that made sense within the cultural framework available to medieval people, even as it terrified them. And it reveals something we need to understand about our own time. Mass psychogenic illness hasn't disappeared. It's evolved. It adapts to new cultural contexts. It spreads through new channels. But the fundamental mechanism remains the same. When populations face unbearable psychological pressure, that pressure will find physical expression. The dancers of Strasbourg weren't weaker than us. They were us, living under circumstances we can barely imagine, finding the only outlet available for unbearable suffering. Their story is a warning about what happens when we ignore the psychological toll of impossible circumstances. It's a reminder that resilience has limits, that mental health can't be separated from the conditions that create or destroy it. 500 years ago, 400 people danced in the streets of Strasbourg. Many danced until they died. The music has stopped, the dancers are dust, but the lesson echoes forward. We need to recognize suffering before it reaches crisis. We need to create conditions where breaking isn't necessary. We need to understand that the strangest, most inexplicable human behaviors are often the most revealing about what we're capable of enduring and what we simply cannot bear. You just spent an hour learning about one of the most bizarre and genuinely disturbing events in human history. And if your understanding of psychology, human behavior, or the power of social stress has fundamentally changed, then this video did exactly what it was supposed to do. Hit that like button so this reaches other people who appreciate how strange and revealing real history actually is. Subscribe to keep exploring historical events that challenge everything you think you know about human nature. And drop a comment telling me what aspect shocked you most. Was it the authorities making people dance harder? The fact that this was mass psychogenic illness rather than anything supernatural? Or the realization that similar things are still happening today in different forms? Thanks for watching, and maybe take a moment to appreciate that whatever stress you're dealing with, at least your body hasn't forced you to dance uncontrollably in the street. Yet.